Thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind. But first, introduction and invitation. Assalamu alaikum. My name's Asad Rehman, as you've just heard. I work for Friends of the Earth, so that's not all my only identity, and I'm really happy to come here and speak. I'm going to try and rip through this because there's quite a lot. And there's some amazing interventions at the beginning, so I'm just going to trying to pull some of those things together. So of course, as Friends of the Earth, I mean, I think very, very similar to most of us, we see life as about having a balance between ourselves and the planet. And, I just wanted to start with this thing about the planetary boundaries. I don't know if people have ever heard about these planetary boundaries, So basically there are 9 planetary boundaries which scientists have determined, which basically maintain our ecosystem, our life on this planet. And we've breached 4 of them. So if you think that as a human body and say there are 9 organs, there are 4 of them that are uncritical at the moment. And one of them is, of course, on climate change. The other one's about biosphere integrity. The other one's about the amount of land that we've changed. And the altered systems, particularly with nitrogen and phosphorus. But climate being the main one. So these are the 4, and so these are the 4 that have been said in Science magazine, that 4 of the 9 have been crossed as a result of human activity. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters quite a lot, actually, because most scientists tell us that if you transgress these boundaries, what's going to happen is that the world is going to become a lot less hospitable place for most of us. It's going to have major impacts on poverty. It's going to deteriorate human well-being, health, all of those issues all around the world, even in rich, wealthy countries. And of course, through history, we as people have had a balance with nature. We've always used nature, whether it's and nature's resources to build things, our roads, cars, etc., and our products. But now, interestingly enough, if you look at this figure always, this graph always, it stuns me. This is for the green planets that you see. If we all had lifestyles compared to other people on this world, if we all had a lifestyle like everybody has it in the United States, we'd need about 4.5 planets to be able to sustain everybody. That's the kind of level of consumption that we've got at the moment. If we all lived like everybody who's in Russia, we'd have about 2.5. If we lived like somebody who's in Brazil, just under 2. And if we all lived like somebody who's in India, we'd only need half the world. And it shows you the inequality in terms of the consumption that we've got around the world, and the fact that we're actually consuming so much. And this overshoot of consumption, is in many, many different things. It's about how we use our land, the ocean, crops, etc. And I think I might have missed it, but I'm going to go backwards one. So each year, scientists, they determine when do we overshoot. When do we go into debt, right? When do we go into debt in the planet? And August 13th of this year is when we went into debt. It's when we consumed so much of the planet that actually we're consuming next year's part of the planet, that the Earth can't sustain itself. And the more and more we're consuming, the more and more debt we're getting. And it's going to come a critical point where the Earth will no longer be able to sustain and produce and bring back the resources that we do. That's whether it's in terms of our soil, water, etc. And quite a frightening thing that we're going and every year it moves faster and faster. Now, environmental justice, which I think is at the core of what we talk about, because, Friends of the Earth, we care about the planet because we care about people. We're not nature, that's not where we start from. We start from the perspective of that the environment matters because it matters to people. And environmental justice is the idea that all of us, irrespective of where we are, what colour, religion, race, etc., have the right to be able to have a good, fair life. We should all have that right. We should be able to sustain ourselves, and that means about the laws and regulations, but also how they're implemented, and of course they're implemented in a very, very different way. But to sum it up, it's basically our right to live in a clean and healthy environment. Every single one of us wants to be able to do that, no matter where we are in the world. And of course, the reality is that the least powerful people suffer the most, whether that's in our countries of origin or here. If you're here in East London, you have an average of a life expectancy 10 years less than if you live in West London. That's because we live by lots of busy roads and air pollution and asthma and etc. And of course, that happens at a global level, internationally, it happens at national level. If you look at who's impacted when there's floods, who's able to have resilience, to be able to come back. And of course, it's also about intergenerational. It's not just about us now, but it's about the generations that are coming and about the impacts that we have on all of those. And for us as Friends of the Earth, we believe that all of these things are linked from global to local, and that the issues are linked, because really the big questions we have to ask ourselves, and I think it's most questions most Muslims ask ourselves, because we're all, I would say, our core is about being just, and the idea of justice is, who has the power, who controls the decisions, and who benefits and who suffers most of these things. And of course the reality is we live in a global world which is deeply, deeply unequal. 1 in 3 of our fellow citizens, that's nearly about 3 billion people, don't have access to clean energy or affordable energy. And that black carbon that people use to be able to cook, kills more people than TB and malaria combined. 1 in 3 people, just over about 2.5 billion people, don't have access to sanitation, and about 1 in 10 don't have access to fresh water. And you may have remember that Bono, and maybe you don't because you're too much. There's a lot of very young people in here. You may remember Live Aid where Bono kept clicking his fingers and he kept saying, every time I click my finger, somebody dies. You say, don't click your fingers then. There's 30,000 avoidable deaths each day. Each day, these are 30,000 deaths that could be avoidable, that are determined partly because of where you're born, what wealth you have, what chance you have in society. Now, of course, and that is represented by some startling figures, that 85 families in the world own as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. That the richest 1% of the world own 50% of all wealth in the world. That's incredible, 50% of all wealth, while the poorest 80% of the world own only just over 5% of global wealth. So the disparity between the rich and the poor is absolutely incredible. And in terms of climate, it is also true that 10% of the population, they're responsible for half the pollution in the atmosphere. And that pollution in the atmosphere is not just polluting our skies, polluting our water, leading to deforestation, killing species, and of course impacting on all of our lives, but particularly the lives of sisters and brothers in the global south. While 50% of the population, the poorest 50%, are responsible only for about 10% of global emissions. And you see that, I think, more starkly when you look at per capita income. And why this issue about climate change is such an issue about justice, right? Because you look at the United States, for example, we've got about 5% of the population of the world, and they have a per capita income of just over $40,000. While India, and you may have seen it in the last couple of weeks, India, if only India would cut its emissions, the world would be all right. But India has 18% of the world's population, but only a per capita income of $3,148. And while LDCs, which are the least developed countries, are the poorest countries, with about 11% of the population of about $1,461. I watched them and I track the negotiations, and I represent Friends of the Earth, and I work with a lot of developing countries. And I always say that the climate negotiations are not about climate. They're not about the environment. They're about political economy. They're about deciding whose corporations and whose businesses and whose economy is going to survive, and ultimately who dies and who lives. And that's as stark as it gets in terms of what the agreements are actually determining. Because the impacts of climate change, as we know, are actually happening all over. And we see that. And we're in a planetary emergency right now. Because if you look around the world, the failing agriculture, food insecurities, intense droughts, floods, typhoons, hurricanes, we've seen, earlier this year, in the hurricane that was just off the coast of Mexico, Hurricane Patricia, had such an intensity, it had never been recorded ever before. They had to have a new level of intensity for it. Last year, heat wave in Australia had such a level of temperature that had never been recorded. The Meteorological Society had to create a new colour on the chart to be able to track that amount of heat. And of course, many of us know about the impacts that have happened, whether it's the drought, whether it's the heat waves in India and Pakistan earlier this year, which killed thousands of people. But the reality, you don't need to be a climate scientist to know climate change is happening. But if you weren't convinced, then of course, climate scientists do a great job to tell you. So there's this thing, it's called the IPCC, it's the International Panel on Climate Change. It's all the world's scientists. They come together, and every 5 years they release a report. They talk about what's happening in terms of the science, what are the impacts, and what we need to do about it. And all of them agree it's human beings, it's our activity that's doing it, And all of their warnings are incredibly stark. They talk about what's going on in terms of on food and agriculture and impacts. And, they talk about how by 2020, this is not in the future, this is not your grandchildren, this is about now, that between 75 and 250 million people in Africa are going to be exposed to increased water stresses because of climate change, that agricultural yields in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa will drop by 50%. And that is actually, of course, having a real impact on everyday reality. Now, there was a study earlier this year, it was quite an alarmist study, but I thought I'd just mention it, in Science magazine, which said even if you limit temperature levels to 2 degrees, the sea level rise, because of the fact that we might be into tipping points where no matter what you do, you get into a cycle, you can't slow it down, the Earth's thing, you could rise up towards 6 metres. That's what one side. But even if you take the most conservative reading is about, well, we'll end up with about 39 inches of sea level rise. Now, you might not think that's much, but that means about a lot of big cities that are on the coast, Dhaka, New York, Rio, etc., could be impacted. It's about 150 million people. And some of the small islands, Maldives, that beautiful island, if you've ever been there, at its highest point is only 8 feet above sea level. Places like Tuvalu in the Pacific have already made an agreement with New Zealand to move their whole people, because Tuvalu as an island and as a state will go underwater. And increasingly this is becoming the reality. And this, of course, is climate scientists now told us this 2-degree warning, is that was old. That the reality of the climate impacts are happening much, much faster than we thought. This 2 degrees that was plucked out of the air by the European Union a few years ago is at about a 50-50 chance of reaching 2 degrees. So the equivalent of that is that you wake up every morning and 30,000 aeroplanes crash, right, somewhere in the world. Would you go to Heathrow Airport? Would you go on an aeroplane? You'd be saying, no way, that's too risky. I'm not going to risk my life if 50% of every aeroplane or 50% of every bus crashes. I want much more safety. But that's what we've been told to accept in terms of 2 degrees. The reality is, in terms of climate justice, we talk about 1.5 because the impacts of climate change are happening much more severe, much more thing. And we see it in lots and lots of different ways. Gobi Desert, 1,390 square miles of the desert expanding each year. It's incredible. 1,390 square miles. Morocco, Tunisia, Libya losing about 386 square miles of productive land. The Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, subsistence farmers being impacted. The impacts of climate change are, of course, very, very real. And they talk about that if we don't do anything about it, not that we're going to keep at 2 degrees, but by the end of the century, we'll be at between 2.5 and up to 7.8 degrees warming of the planet. And if you want to keep to 1.5, they say we've got about maximum about 10 years to reduce our budget, stay within that budget. And if you want to do 2 degrees, it's about 15 to 20 years. Now, that sounds like a weird thing, 2 degrees, I know it doesn't make reality to most people, but the World Bank, not the most revolutionary of organisations, very, very conservative institution, talked about, and it did a report that if you're at between 4 to 5 degrees warming, they thought the actual world would only be able to sustain about 1 billion people. Then think about that. That's about 1 billion people. There's about 6 to 7 billion people. They said that that's not possible to sustain that amount of people if you get temperatures going towards 4 to 5 degrees warming. But the reality of now, of course, is climate impacts are happening. Whether it's Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, 10,000 dead, 2 million people displaced, or whether it's the floods in Pakistan, one flood, 30 million people impacted, or the drought in the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa, 9 countries, 15 million people, or one tropical storm, just one storm, Erica, which was in the Caribbean in September of this year, put back development in that one island by 20 years. And of course, all of this happening at 0.8 or 1 degree, depending on the Nino effect, etc., exasperated. But, oops. And so it's really difficult. Okay, it's really difficult to talk about climate political refugees because I think they're refugees, right? Because somebody who's fleeing, for example, the Arab Spring, food prices tripled in the Arab Spring. Why? Because agriculture collapsed. Are they political refugees or climate refugees? In Syria, you heard, 80% of livestock died. 2 million people moved from the rural to the urban areas, exasperating existing tensions. Are they political refugees or climate refugees? And we know, of course, like the map that you heard earlier on, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, all of these countries are going to be at risk in terms of more severe drought. And even John Kerry, the Secretary, US Secretary of State, talked about climate refugees. He said, all these migrants that you talk about, wait till the climate refugees start. Now, the reality, of course, is that as refugees, there is a refugee convention. It's the 1951 Refugee Convention. It tells you defines who an individual is, and it tells you, you could on race, religion, nationality, political group opinion, or membership of a particular social group. There's definitions. There are refugees, of course, who fear being persecuted, leave their country unable to safely return. There's the asylum seekers. There's so many confusing terms that people think, oh, do they all mean the same thing? But what's interesting, of course, is that the majority of people are internally displaced. Right? So they're the people who leave their homes but are actually displaced within their own countries. And they don't have any protection internationally. And of course, as migrants, there are so-called economic migrants. There are legal economic migrants, like the guest workers that the Europeans brought from Turkey to Germany to work, or there are people illegal without papers. Now, climate environmental refugees, well, people talk about climate refugees and say they're people who leave their home because of climate change. And environmental refugees are people who leave their home because of natural disasters. Now, it's very hard to tell what's the difference between a natural disaster and a climate disaster, because increasingly, of course, all weather impacts are exasperating every single environmental disaster, whether it's a storm or a superstorm, etc. Now, you heard earlier just about the facts in terms of how many people there are on the move. There's about 38 million internally displaced people. There's about 1.66 million asylum seekers and about 20 million refugees. Now, the UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees, says there's about 36 million people now displaced by natural disasters. Interestingly, the International Red Cross is now saying that more environmental refugees have been created each year than political refugees. And of course, we all saw the pictures last year and this year of people in the Mediterranean, broken bodies, men, women and children, right? And 3,500 people they calculated died in the Mediterranean this last year. They calculate 3,500 easily surpassed this year. Now, most of us will never know. We can't go and say, what did you flee? Well, were you fleeing because of an environmental reason or a climate reason? Were you an internally displaced person or a refugee or an asylum seeker? But when you look at where people come from, it tells you a lot. Because look where people are coming from. They're coming from the Sahel. They're coming from the Horn of Africa. They're coming from all of these countries where, of course, there are many, many different reasons why people leave home. But climate change is exasperating each and every one of them. And, of course, they're not over here, right? The reality is they're not bloody over here. 80% of all refugees stay within developing countries. Only a small percentage ever make it to developed countries. And those percentages that do make it to developed countries tend to, of course, be people who are educated, speak English, have some access to resources or family connections that are able to help people. The poorest of the poor never manage to escape their countries. They tend to either be displaced internally or into the next place. So, the reality of why you need to have a justice approach to climate, why we as Muslims need to be tackling climate change, is because fundamentally, climate change is the biggest inequality in the world. The richest of the people who've created climate change are not facing the impacts, but the poorest, who have no responsibility for climate change, are the ones facing the impacts of climate change. And those impacts are devastating their everyday life. So now I want to show you these two little graphs. So this is a graph between fair shares between blue and green, right? So if everybody did, rich countries and poor countries did what they were meant to do in terms of tackling climate change fairly, then the blue bit is what the poor countries would do, and the green bit is what the rich countries would do. In reality, when you look at the second bar, the green bit is what rich countries have promised to do, and the blue bit is what poorer countries are doing. So poorer countries are doing more than rich countries, even though that's not their responsibility, even though they're still trying to deal with all these other issues about poverty and eradication and issues around sustainable development. Here, much more simpler. You might have keep hearing, oh, it's India and it's China, etc. The red bit is what countries are actually pledging to do. The grey bit is what they should be doing if it was done on fair shares, right? And the reality is, if you look at the European Union, it's doing about 1/5 of what it should be doing. The United States is doing about 1/5. Japan about 1/10. Russia about Russia not even got onto the scale of doing its fair share. But look at some of the developing countries, whether they're small developing countries or bigger developing countries, they're actually doing much more than they should be doing. Now, look, when you tackle climate change ultimately is about three key things, right? It's about how we produce and consume our energy. Right, we're polluting the atmosphere because we're burning fossil fuels. Scientists tell us we have to keep about 80% of all non-fossil fuels in the ground. But what are we doing? We're giving new license to drill in the Arctic, going for fracking. We're saying going to deep sea water drilling. What are we doing in terms of food? Our food system, it's the second biggest production of greenhouse gas. We have an industrial agricultural system which, as you heard, uses so much water, but also buries 40% of all food that's created, that we produce, is buried back into the ground because it's not viable for the industrial agricultural system to be able to sell, or don't want to sell that food to poor, don't want to sell that food. So how we produce and consume our food is really important. Of course, stopping deforestation, stopping cutting down forests. Well, why do people cut down forests? Well, it's two things. One, because of the demands here, but secondly, it's to create the beef. It's to cut down the forest, to plant the soil, to feed the cow, to give all of us our chicken shops and our beef shops and etc. etc. It's an unsustainable model of production and consuming food, and therefore justice for impacted people, how we stand with impacted people, is really important. And I'm being told to shut up, but I'm going to just say one thing. I've come back from Paris, and you might have heard about, Paris, great deal, it's a monumental deal, blah blah blah. I'm telling you, don't believe that. Okay. So the reality is what this is has been a massive great escape from rich countries who shifted their responsibility onto the poorer countries. So not only do they not cut their emissions, they have not cut any of their emissions. In the key time to cut your emissions is between now and 2020. This is a critical period. Rich countries aren't putting anything. The European Union has got a target of 20% emission reduction. So it's about it's going to reduce its emissions by 20% by 2020. It already met that last year. It's going to be at 30% by 2020. But it refuses to increase its emission reduction target because it wants to make it look like it's doing much, much more. Climate finance, they're meant to support poorer countries with this 100 billion. This 100 billion that's been plucked out of thin air. When you look at what's needed, it's way, way more than that. And if we think that that's a lot of money, let's remember we spent 6 trillion on bombing Iraq and Afghanistan, 11 trillion on financing on bailing out the banks. We spend 5.4 trillion each year, us as taxpayers, giving direct and indirect subsidies to dirty energy corporations around the world. There's absolutely no lack of money. It's not an issue about money. It's about who makes a decision about where to go money. And the most outrageous thing that was agreed in Paris is that the UK government, backed by the United States, bullied poorer countries into accepting an agreement which said that there's this thing called loss and damage, which basically says that you can try as much as you can to reduce your emissions, you can adapt as much as you can, but then there's going to be loss and damage. This is when seawater is going to get into your water table, it's going to make your salt work. This is about in Bangladesh, that the sea level rise is going to lose a third of your agricultural land. This is about the fact that people are going to be displaced. And they put in there an exclusion zone, which means forever rich countries will not be liable for any liability or compensation to poorer countries for these impacts. So not only do they want to carry on polluting, they actually don't want to provide support. So the real, I think, thing for us as Muslims, not just because we are Muslim and these are countries that are being impacted by, many of the countries are being impacted on Muslim, it's because we believe in justice. And for justice's sake, actually this fight is around, in this country now, we have to say, we cannot allow any fracking. We have to get renewable energy. We have to change the way we produce our food. We have to stand up and make sure our voices are being heard. Because this really is a generational fight. It's probably the most important fight that we're ever going to fight. People who might, people say, well, it's like the fight against slavery, or it's the fight against apartheid. It actually is going to be much, much more, because what we're talking about is potentially the lives of not just millions, but hundreds of millions, if not billions of people being impacted by climate change. Thank you. Thank you.